Hey there, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments.
You know you're not the favorite when your face disappears from the fridge door. That's the place where families pretend everything's fine, where photos of graduations, first communions, birthdays, and grandbabies get pinned up like a highlight reel for the outside world to see. My mom's fridge used to have me front and center, right next to the school calendar and the emergency numbers, like I was still part of the family's pulse. But now, it's just wedding photos of my sister Karen. Karen's kids, a church schedule, and a coupon for a Bible study cruise she'll never take. I hadn't been on that fridge in over 5 years, and that was supposed to be the silent message, the little whisper in plain sight. You don't belong here anymore. But this time, the message wasn't silent. It was screaming. And it didn't come from a fridge. It came from Facebook. It was Sunday morning. I was nursing a cup of cold coffee and going over quarterly figures for my company's next round of funding when my cousin Rachel tagged me in a comment under a picture I hadn't seen before. The photo was warm, golden, full of smiles and coordinated outfits. Everyone was there. Karen and her husband, Jim with his 3 boys, my parents, looking like retirement had blessed them with a second youth. Even Aunt Linda with her never-aging perm. They were all standing on the porch of what looked like our old lake house. And then I realized it was our lake house, my lake house, the one I had signed over to my parents 8 years ago, thinking I was doing something good, a family gesture. It was the kind of picture you'd frame and hang over a fireplace. Everyone was looking into the camera like they had nothing to hide. Everyone except me, because I wasn't in it. Not only had I missed the photo, I hadn't even known there was a gathering. No text, no email, no, hey, we're all getting together at the lake house this weekend. Hope you can make it. Nothing. I was less than an afterthought. I was erased. Forgotten would have almost been kinder. Forgotten implies they meant to include you but got distracted. This wasn't that. This was deliberate. And the caption under the photo made it worse. Family is everything. I stared at those 3 words until they blurred. There's a kind of rage that doesn't announce itself with screaming or broken dishes. It simmers in silence, coils around your gut, and builds until you start questioning every memory you thought was solid. I sat back and did something I hadn't done in years. I counted. In the last 5 years, I'd been excluded from 4 family holidays, missed 3 milestone birthday parties, and was never even told when my own nephew graduated college. They always had excuses. We figured you were too busy, Pator. It was just a small get-together, nothing special. Or my favorite, we didn't think you'd want to come all the way out here. And I bought it over and over, because that's what you do when you're clinging to hope that maybe it's just a misunderstanding. But this time, there was no misunderstanding. The picture told the whole damn story. I don't cry often, not because I'm made of stone or anything, but because crying always felt like giving someone else too much power. Still, that photo broke something open in me. It wasn't the image itself. It was the knowledge that they didn't even think they needed to hide it from me anymore. They didn't care if I saw it. They had moved on, and I wasn't even a footnote. That's when the memories started flooding back. Karen pushing me out of her room when we were kids and telling me to go bother Mom. My mom rolling her eyes every time I talked about tech stuff at dinner, saying, "You always make things sound so complicated." Jim shrugging whenever I asked why nobody told me about family plans, saying, "I just go where Karen tells me." It was like every minor dismissal suddenly linked into a full chain, and I realized this wasn't a drift. This was a decision. At some point, quietly and collectively, they decided I didn't belong. The coffee had gone completely cold by then. I picked up my phone and opened the group chat labeled Family Circle. The one I had been removed from 3 years ago after some fight about politics I barely even remembered. I stared at the empty chat history, thumb hovering over the keyboard, wondering what kind of message I could send that would make them feel what I was feeling, but I didn't type anything. What could I say that would matter to people who made their peace with leaving me out? I closed the app, got up, started pacing. Rage is funny. It doesn't always come with shouting or fury. Sometimes it feels like strategy, like clarity, like cold, sharp logic. That photo wasn't just a slap in the face. It was a dare a public one, so I screenshotted it. Not out of sentimentality, but for evidence. I needed to see the image again later when I'd cooled down to remind myself I wasn't crazy. And maybe I needed it for something else too. Because later that night, as I passed a billboard off Route 82, one of those big electronic ones right across from the megachurch my mom dragged us to every Sunday growing up, I had a thought. Just a little seed. A dangerous one. The kind that grows in silence and shame and ends with a bang instead of a whimper. And I smiled. Because if they didn't want to remember me the kind way, maybe it was time they remembered me the loud way. The first time I understood that Karen and I were playing different games in the same house, we were 12 and 9, respectively. And she had just lied to my mother about something stupid, a broken vase in the hallway, or a spill on the carpet, something innocent enough on its own. But what stuck with me wasn't the lie itself. It was the way she delivered it, effortlessly and with those eyes that could cry on command if she thought it would land her closer to what she wanted. She looked straight at my mom, said, "Melissa knocked it over chasing the dog," and blinked like she couldn't believe I would do something so reckless. And just like that, I was grounded for the weekend, not allowed to go to Jessica Walker's sleepover, even though I had nothing to do with that vase, and Karen knew it. But what cut deeper was the way my mom didn't even hesitate to believe her. Not one question, not one doubt, just a sigh, a disappointed shake of the head in my direction, and the familiar phrase, "Melissa, when will you learn?" It became our rhythm after that. Karen would stir the water, and I'd drown in it. She had this skill, almost surgical, of knowing exactly how to paint herself as the peacekeeper, the golden child, the one who smoothed things over after I, the difficult one, made everything harder. And I played my role too, though I didn't realize it at the time. I leaned into the independence they assigned to me, became the girl who didn't need anyone, who didn't cry when her birthday was forgotten, or when she got a C on a group project because no one else pulled their weight. I taught myself to work harder, be sharper, never expect praise or validation, because those were already taken and hoarded by the smiling daughter with the neat handwriting and choir solos. What I didn't know then, but I see so clearly now, was that Karen wasn't just playing the game, she was rigging it. It was around the age of 30 that I started putting real distance between myself and the family. I was building my first company back then, living on the edge of burnout and euphoria, half eating takeout and half pitching to investors from an apartment that didn't even have curtains. Karen was having her third child, a girl this time, and the baby photos came flooding in before the kid could even open her eyes. I sent flowers. I sent money for a college fund. I didn't get a thank you. Mom called once to ask why I hadn't visited yet, and I told her I was swamped with deadlines. She sighed and said, "You always have an excuse." And yet, whenever I did make the effort, holidays, birthdays, random Sunday dinners, I was treated like a guest, not a daughter. Karen always introduced me as my sister who does something in tech, with this lazy wave of her hand, like I was some distant cousin they couldn't quite place. And when I offered to help with dishes or bring dessert, I was told to just relax, you've done enough, in that tone that said, or I was intruding rather than contributing. At some point, I stopped offering, stopped calling, started giving them the distance they had always silently demanded. But even with all that distance, I never expected them to cut me out entirely until that picture, until that weekend. What twisted the knife was the location, my lake house. I'd bought it in my early 30s, before my company went national, back when success still felt shaky and provisional. It was a beat-up little place by Lake Monroe, nothing fancy, but it was mine. I poured money into it over 5 years, renovated it from the studs, and the first time my parents visited, my mother said, "Well, I hope this wasn't too much of a splurge." When I signed the property over to them later on, after they retired and were looking for a quiet place to spend summers, I told myself it was a generous gift, a way to reconnect, a chance to show them that I still cared despite everything. They thanked me, but in that muted, almost embarrassed way, as if I'd made a mistake and they didn't want to owe me anything. But they took it. And now they were throwing parties there, without me. I called my brother Jim that night, not because I expected sympathy, but because Jim has always been the least volatile of the family, neutral, avoidant, incapable of confrontation to the point of absurdity. He picked up on the second ring. "Hey, Jim," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure," he said, already uneasy. "Did you know about the get-together at the lake house last weekend?" There was a pause. Then, "Yeah, I mean, Karen said it was just something small." "Everyone was there, Jim." "Yeah," he said again, and I could hear him shifting uncomfortably. "She said you probably wouldn't want to come, that you usually don't." "I usually don't because no one tells me," I said, my throat tightening. "That's not the same thing." He exhaled slowly, then said something I'll never forget. "It's just easier for Mom when you're not around." I didn't respond. I couldn't. The line stayed open for a few seconds longer before Jim added, like it made anything better, "It's not personal. You know how Mom is." "But that's the thing, isn't it? It is personal. It always has been." I hung up without another word and sat there staring into nothing, trying to decide whether I was sad or furious or both. Because if this was just a Karen thing, I could chalk it up to sibling rivalry. But hearing Jim say it, hearing that everyone was complicit, that they had quietly, maybe even unanimously, agreed I was more trouble than I was worth, that was betrayal. Not the big dramatic kind, but the slow grinding erosion that eats away at you one passive-aggressive moment at a time. And that's when I started planning. Not revenge, at least not yet, but something sharper, a mirror maybe, something they couldn't ignore, because if they wanted to erase me from their narrative, I was going to write a new chapter. One they'd have to read every single day, even if they had to see it from their car windows, even if it towered 40 feet above their heads, even if it made Sunday morning worship just a little bit uncomfortable. There's a specific kind of stillness that fills the air just before you make a decision you know can't be undone. A kind of electric quiet that seeps into your bloodstream and makes everything feel sharper. Every sound, every thought, every blink. And that's exactly the silence I sat in 3 nights after seeing the lake house photo, parked just off the exit ramp near my parents' town, hands clenched around the steering wheel so tightly that I could feel the plastic imprinting into my skin. As I debated whether I should storm into my mother's kitchen uninvited and demand, in the most unapologetic tone I could muster, why the hell they had decided to cut me out of their lives like I was an inconvenient appendix. They'd finally gotten around to removing. It wasn't a graceful moment or a proud one. I wasn't composed or dignified or even rational at that point. I was just hurt, plain and raw, with that searing kind of humiliation that feels too private to explain to anyone and too public to ignore, especially when it's plastered all over social media for the rest of your extended family and old high school friends to see. But as I sat there, arguing with myself about whether confrontation would give me closure or just more scars, a black SUV pulled into the driveway of the house across the street, and I recognized Karen's husband, Mark, the same man who used to try to hit on me at family barbecues before remembering I was his wife's sister. He spotted me almost immediately, and instead of pretending not to, he walked over to the car with the kind of smirk that only people completely insulated from consequences can pull off. "Melissa," he said, tapping the window with 2 fingers, like we were old friends who hadn't seen each other in years, instead of 2 people who barely tolerated sharing air. "You okay?" I rolled down the window just enough to speak, not enough to invite him in. "Just passing through," I said, though we both knew I hadn't driven 2 hours out of my way on a Wednesday night for sightseeing. He nodded like he understood everything and nothing at the same time, and leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "Look, I probably shouldn't say anything, but it's not personal. They just thought it might be better this way. Karen said you always seem uncomfortable at these things." And that's when it clicked. Not just the exclusion or the silence or the photo, but the choreography behind it. The invisible campaign that Karen had been running for years to quietly reframe me in everyone's mind as the difficult one, the antisocial one, The black sheep with too much ambition and too little tact. The one who didn't fit the mold and made everyone else feel bad for fitting it so damn well. Better for who, I asked, and my voice came out colder than I meant, but I didn't apologize. He gave a shrug that was as infuriating as it was cowardly and said, "For your mom, mostly. You know how she is. She wants peace." And there it was, peace, the word people use when they really mean silence, when what they want isn't harmony, but the absence of discomfort, the erasure of anything that doesn't fit the soft, staged version of reality they've chosen to present to the world. My presence disrupted that illusion. I brought questions, confrontation, opinions, ambition, stories that didn't revolve around kids' soccer games or church bake sales. I brought history they hadn't healed from and truths they didn't want to acknowledge. So they cut me out. Not with knives, but with quiet omissions and collective avoidance. And everyone played along. By the time I got back on the highway, I wasn't angry anymore. Not the kind of anger that burns hot and fades fast. I was something else entirely. I was strategic. Because I finally understood that what hurt the most wasn't being excluded. It was being lied about. Being painted into a caricature and then judged for not fitting the scene. And that's when I knew I needed to do something. Not to get them back. Not really, but to reclaim the narrative. To remind them, and everyone watching, that I was still here, still standing, still the same girl who rebuilt herself brick by brick when the family house started crumbling. The idea didn't come to me all at once. It started as a flicker, a bitter joke I whispered to myself under my breath while passing yet another billboard on my drive back to the city. The kind that said "need a divorce lawyer" or "Jesus saves, do you?" But then I passed one that was blank. The kind that rotates digital ads depending on the hour, and it hit me. What if my face was up there, towering above them, impossible to ignore, staring down on their Sunday mornings with the quiet power of someone who no longer needed their approval? It wasn't about revenge, not really. It was about visibility, about agency, about putting myself back into the narrative with a boldness they couldn't erase or mute or unfollow. I got home and opened my laptop, not to look at the family photo again, but to look up Billboard rental companies. I found one, ironically the same company Karen had used years ago to advertise her husband's plumbing business during a local county fair. I called the number listed and spoke to a man named Rich, who was overly cheerful in that way salespeople are when they know they've got you on the hook. "Yes, ma'am, we've got open inventory along Route 82. Right near that big intersection by the Methodist church," he said. "High traffic, lots of visibility. What are you looking to advertise?" "Myself," I said flatly. He chuckled, thinking I was kidding. I wasn't. "I want a digital slot, 3 months minimum, high-res image. I'll send the creative. I want it up by Sunday." "Got a business name or logo you'd like to include?" he asked. I paused. "Forbes," I said, and it was technically the truth. I had been listed in their 40 under 40 for women in tech the year before. Not that anyone in my family ever mentioned it. Rich whistled. "All right then, let's get you seen." And as I uploaded the image, just my face, the Forbes logo, and the words, "Remember me now?" I didn't feel petty or vindictive. I felt something closer to rebirth. Because maybe I wasn't their kind of daughter, their kind of sister, their kind of woman. But I was someone, and now they'd have to see that. Every single day. There's something strangely satisfying about executing a plan that no one sees coming, not because you hit it so well, but because they never bothered to look in your direction in the first place, assuming you'd keep playing your assigned role, quiet, distant, forgettable, until you either faded completely or found another family to orbit, one that might consider your presence something other than disruptive. So when Sunday rolled around and the new billboard went live, lit up in glowing resolution just across the street from the church, where my mother played piano every week without fail, I didn't feel triumphant in the cinematic way you might expect. I felt calm, almost surgical, as if I had made a precise incision in a system that had long needed to be disrupted. The image was simple by design. My face, not smiling, not inviting, just direct and unflinching, framed by a black background, the iconic Forbes logo in the corner, and underneath it all, in bold white capital letters, "Remember me now?" I wanted it to be undeniable, not aggressive, not vindictive, but unmissable. I didn't need their apologies, and I didn't want their guilt. I just wanted to interrupt their carefully curated storyline, the one where I was the absent one, the one who never showed up, the one who couldn't be bothered, even though it was they who had slowly, methodically erased me. It didn't take long for the ripple to reach me. The first text came from my cousin Rachel, who never takes sides in anything but always wants the inside scoop, and it simply said, "Girl, that Billboard, savage." I didn't reply. Then came Jim, ever the peacekeeper, typing so slowly that I could almost hear his hesitation through the bubbles that popped up and disappeared twice before the final message arrived. "That was a lot, Mel. Maybe too far?" I stared at that one for a long while, not because it stung, but because it confirmed what I already knew, that even now, even after being systematically pushed aside, I was still expected to consider everyone else's comfort before asserting my own existence. Too far. They had drawn the boundary lines years ago, buried them under passive aggression and vague excuses, and now that I had dared to cross them with the only language they couldn't dismiss, public visibility, they were suddenly the wounded party? The real earthquake hit just after noon, when my mother, having apparently endured an entire church service with my face glaring down at her from across the parking lot, finally called. The last time she dialed my number was Christmas 2 years ago. And even then, it was more out of obligation than interest. Her voice was tight, clipped, the kind of tone she used when she was embarrassed and couldn't admit it. "Melissa," she began, and I knew instantly from the way she said my name that she was furious, but trying to mask it under the brittle veil of Christian politeness. "What exactly is the meaning of that sign?" I didn't offer a greeting. I didn't ask how church was. I just answered her question directly. "It means exactly what it says," I told her, my voice steady. I figured since I'm not welcome in person, I might as well show up another way. "That's not fair," she snapped, losing the mask. "You're twisting things." "No," I said calmly, "I'm just making them visible." There was a pause so heavy it almost cracked the line. I could hear her breathing, short and uneven, and for a moment I thought she might cry. But then she did what she always did. She shifted the blame. "Your sister said you never wanted to be included," she said, as if that explained everything. "She said you get uncomfortable at gatherings, that you prefer your work over family." "That's not true," I replied, and it wasn't even anger I felt anymore, just exhaustion. I said no to a few things because I was building something on my own. That doesn't mean I wanted to be erased. "Well, maybe if you had reached out more." "I did reach out," I interrupted, my voice rising now. "I sent gifts. I asked to host holidays. I showed up when no one else bothered. You just didn't see it, because Karen was always louder, and you never questioned her version of things." Another silence, then almost bitterly. "You've always needed to make a statement." "Maybe," I said, "but only because no one ever listened when I didn't." She hung up without another word. That night the calls slowed, and the silence returned, but it wasn't the same kind of silence I'd been living with for years. It was denser now, charged, uncomfortable in the way only truth can make people uncomfortable. I imagined the parking lot after church, the way people would glance up, pretend not to stare, the way Karen would grit her teeth behind a frozen smile, the way Jim would shuffle his feet, hands in pockets, avoiding my gaze even on a screen. It wasn't revenge, not exactly. It was a mirror, a sharp one, and they didn't like what it showed them. By Monday morning, local gossip sites had picked up the story. Forbes tech exec buys billboard across from family's church, calls out being erased. There were comments, of course, some calling it petty, others praising the boldness, many speculating wildly about the drama behind the act. But I didn't engage. I didn't need to. The message wasn't for strangers, it was for them. And just when I thought the storm might settle into the usual cycle of avoidance and minimization, my phone rang again. This time, it was my father. We hadn't spoken in over a year. "Melissa?" he said softly, cautiously, like he wasn't sure if I'd hang up. "We need to talk." Something in his tone stopped me. There was a weariness there I hadn't heard before, a crack in the practiced neutrality he'd always maintained. He'd never taken sides, never defended me, never challenged Mom or Karen. Not because he agreed, but because silence had always been easier. But now something had shifted. "There's something you don't know," he said. And just like that, the air shifted again, heavy with something deeper than the billboard, deeper than the photo, deeper than all the birthdays and holidays, and half-hearted apologies they'd never offered. "What don't I know?" I asked. He took a breath and the line went quiet. "I think it's time you learned the truth." When my father asked me to meet him in person to talk, his voice unusually low, not quite trembling, but certainly hollow in a way I hadn't heard since my grandfather died. I wasn't sure whether I was walking into a confession, a reckoning, or just another carefully worded attempt to smooth things over the way he had always done. The same way he used to sit between my mother and me during family arguments like some reluctant referee who didn't really want to call a foul on either side. Because taking a side meant accountability, and accountability in our family had always been treated like a hand grenade with the pin already out. We met at a quiet diner just off the highway, one of those places where the coffee tastes like the pot's been on since sunrise, and the waitresses all call you hun, regardless of whether they like you or not. He looked older than I remembered, not in the dramatic way people tend to describe after time apart, but in the subtle erosion of posture and spark, like the years had weighed down on him one choice at a time, until standing upright was less about bones and more about pretending nothing had bent him. He didn't offer a hug, and I didn't reach for one. We just sat there, across from each other, the laminated menus untouched, the air between us buzzing with the kind of tension that doesn't come from a single argument, but from a lifetime of small avoidances finally crashing into something undeniable. He spoke first, after a long silence that seemed to stretch over decades, and when he didn't clear his throat or ease into it with pleasantries. He just looked at me, eyes heavy, and said, "Your mother didn't want you in the will." I didn't blink, I didn't flinch. I just let the words settle in the space between us like dust and sunlight, familiar and strange all at once. "She's been pushing for years," he continued, his voice hoarse from disuse or guilt. I couldn't tell. "She said you didn't need it, that you had your own life, your own money, that the others, Karen, Jim, needed more stability, and that you would understand." "Did I ever say I would?" I asked, not loudly, but with a firmness that made his fingers tense around the edge of his mug. He shook his head slowly. "No, you didn't, and I never asked." There it was again, the passivity, the quiet complicity that had always made me more furious than any of Karen's lies or my mother's manipulations. It wasn't just that he hadn't defended me, it was that he'd stood there, watched it happen, and convinced himself that silence was a form of peace rather than permission. He could have stopped it, he could have told me, he could have asked me what I wanted, instead of assuming that financial success meant emotional insulation, as though a thriving company and a Forbes feature could replace a father's belief in his daughter's right to belong. "She also told Karen she could sell the lake house," he added, almost as an afterthought, though his eyes betrayed that he knew exactly what he was saying. "That it was just paperwork, since you'd signed it over, and that you probably wouldn't care either way." I let out a breath that was almost a laugh, though there was nothing funny about it. "So she got the house, Karen got the narrative, Jim got to stay neutral, and I got forgotten." "You got free," he said quietly, but I shook my head. "No, can't," I said. "I got written out." He looked down then, ashamed or just tired, and I realized something I hadn't fully understood until that moment. He wasn't telling me this out of courage or redemption. He was telling me because the billboard had forced his hand. It wasn't the truth he wanted to share. It was the consequences he could no longer avoid. And in that realization, I felt something colder than rage settle into me. I felt resolve. Later that week, I updated the billboard, not to lash out, not to gloat, but to close the loop. The new image was almost identical. My face, the Forbes logo, but now, beneath it, 3 new words in the same clean, unapologetic font. Just sold. Thanks for the memories. The lake house had been mine once. Not just legally, but emotionally. It had been the one place I had poured myself into, literally rebuilt from the floors, up with money I hadn't yet earned and time I couldn't afford. Believing that if I created something beautiful and offered it freely, it might anchor me back into a family that had never made room for the kind of daughter I turned out to be. But they didn't want the daughter who could wire an entire smart home system or pitch a startup in front of investors twice her age. They wanted the one who baked pies for church sales and kept her voice low at dinner. And since I could never be that girl, they decided I didn't count at all. So I sold the house, quietly, legally, completely. The deed had still listed me as the original owner, and what my mother and Karen hadn't known, what no one had cared to check, was that the transfer they'd assumed was final had never been fully recorded at the county level. One missing document, one unfiled piece of paperwork, and suddenly their little vacation haven belonged to someone else, permanently, irrevocably. The calls came again, this time in panicked clusters. Karen raging about betrayal, my mother devastated, Jim saying he was disappointed in how I handled things. But I didn't respond. Not because I didn't have things to say. Believe me, I had volumes. But because I had said everything I needed to on that billboard, in 40-foot font, with the entire town watching. On the 4th of July, instead of attending any family function, I spent the afternoon across the street with my neighbors, a couple in their 60s who'd invited me over for burgers and beer and stories about their grandkids. We sat on folding chairs and watched the fireworks from the driveway, and I laughed more in those 2 hours than I had at any family event in the last decade. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't revenge, it was peace, real peace. The kind you earn when you stop asking for approval and start giving yourself permission. People always say blood is thicker than water, but that's only half the phrase. The full saying is, the blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb. And I think maybe, just maybe, that means the family you choose matters more than the one you're born into. I never took the billboard down. Some part of me wanted it to stay, not as a monument to bitterness, but as a reminder that erasure is not quiet. That silence, when broken, echoes louder than a scream. I don't know if they'll ever understand what they did. I don't even know if they care to. But every time they drive by that church, they'll have to look up, see my face, and remember the girl they tried to forget. And maybe, just maybe, they'll finally start wondering what else they never knew about me.